This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is Jesse James, the famed American outlaw. I have Alfred Dockery to speak about it, and the conversation will begin in a moment. The subject is American outlaw Jesse James. Alfred Dockery is the man that you see before you. Alfred has written about crime on Medium and a number of other sites online. I want to welcome you to the show. Let me just ask you first. I like to give my guests a few minutes to speak about who they are. If you could tell a little bit about your background generally, your background in writing on crime, and what has drawn you over the years to Jesse James.
Hi, Dan. I'm Alfred Dockery. I'm a writer, editor, and co-author of Blood on the Blue Ridge, Historic Appalachian Crimes from 1808 to 2024. And basically, I was researching a different subject. I was researching Major Lewis Redmond, the Moonshine King of the Carolinas. And during the late 1880s, he was as well known as Jesse James, but today he is almost forgotten. And what got me interested was trying to figure out why Jesse James is a household word to today, where other equally successful or unsuccessful criminals weren't. And that's my entry to Jesse James.
Well, let's just pick up on that before we, go through the litany of the James gang and the war and the bushwhacking and that kind of things. I know, and you rightly point out, there's probably been 3 or 4 dozen, maybe more films made with Jesse James as either a featured character or at least a background character to give color. He's someone who, by any measure, was not the nicest guy, a murderer, likely a mass murderer. Yet he has appeared, as you mentioned, in media through all that. Is it simply because of the tale of him being a sort of Robin Hood, and the fact that he has, let's face it, a cool alliterative name, Jesse James, that rolls off the tongue, whereas a lot of other criminals' names don't?
Well, a great deal of it has to do with Reconstruction and him being seen as a Confederate who did not give up, who did not surrender, who kept taking it to the railroads, taking it to the banks. He's inseparable from the era in which he's in.
Well, when you say that, there are other people like Billy the Kid, a little bit later Butch Cassidy. There's any number. I live in the Texas area. There's a dozen or so other outlaws, robbers, bandits, whatever you want to call them, that did as much of, if not even worse than James. So why do you think, say, a Sam Bass, to use a Texas example, is not up there with Jesse James in terms of name recognition?
I think a lot of it had to do with Jesse. He actually worked the media quite a bit. He had a press agent, more or less, in the form of a gentleman named John Newman Edwards, who helped get him out in front of people. And the same was true of Lewis Redmond. He had a gentleman named Carl McKinley who wrote very long, approving articles about his activities. You can't get very far in back then without getting into the newspapers.
Now, when you talk about the newspapers, in that era, long before radio, much less TV, film, or the internet, there were things called dime novels. And Jesse James appeared in a lot of these fictional novels that people could buy for a dime. Do you think that helped also propel his mythos?
That was definitely a huge part of his mythos. And, over time, his reputation got very much elevated and repurposed because he was, for all intents and purposes, a sociopath. I mean, he was a stone cold killer. And as far as the Robin Hood aspect, I haven't found any evidence whatsoever that he really gave money to anyone.
I know I've done a few other recent shows about criminals like the Zodiac Killer, and so forth, the Cleveland Torso murderer. But Jesse James probably killed as many people as both of them combined. Yet it's interesting that they are considered quote unquote serial killers, whereas he is just considered an outlaw. That if he killed someone, it was in the commission of another crime, so he's not as bad. What do you think accounts for the fact that Old West outlaws, in a sense, were looked up to more as heroes, say, than contemporary mass murderers of the 20th and now 21st century?
Well, they actually fought. They actually fought with their victims. They fought with the people they opposed in the Civil War. They were out there gunfighting. They didn't just sneak up behind people and murder them.
Um, so let's talk about Jesse James growing up, because he came from a family that was in, I believe it was in the Missouri area. And what kind of childhood did he have? I mean, people often try to associate criminal behavior with bad childhood. Was he raised in a strict family? Was he from a devout Christian family? Or was he just allowed to run wild?
Well, his father was a very well known and very thought of Baptist minister and also a farmer. And he went to California to save souls during the gold rush, caught a fever, and wound up in a shallow grave. So at the age of 3, Jesse lost his father. His father had quite a bit in the way of debt, and probate back then was not particularly helpful to widows. So they wound up very quickly destitute. T.J. Stiles, in his book Jesse James, The Last Rebel, points out that one of his earliest memories would have been an auction where they basically sold off most of their belongings to pay his father's debts.
Um, and what was his mother like?
His mother, she was, for the time, well educated. She was 6 feet tall. She really struggled when his father died, but through 2 very strategic marriages, she managed to lift the family back into the upper middle class. She became a force of nature in her own right. She was a slave owner. She was a secessionist, and her beliefs in that were rock solid. If if secessionism had like a branch office in Missouri and needed a regional manager, she would have taken care of that for them.
Now, he did have 2 full siblings, a sister, a younger sister, and an older brother. Frank James was almost as well known as Jesse was, especially back in the day. Um, Tell me a little bit about both of them. Obviously, Frank became an outlaw as well.
Well, I don't know very much about his sister. Frank, he enlisted in the Civil War. He was captured, paroled, and then after he came back home, he went back and became a guerrilla. And Jesse followed him into the guerrilla ranks. He was said to be a quiet man. He was thoughtful. He had like 10 years of school. He's said to have read Shakespeare. I sort of feel for him a little bit in that I really think in several instances he had to bail Jesse out of situations that didn't have to be anywhere near as extreme as Jesse made them.
Yeah, the common wisdom of the 2 brothers is Jesse was the older, calmer, wiser one, and I should say Frank was the older, wiser one, and Jesse was the young hothead who would fly off the handle. And does that seem to be what your research bears out?
From what I've been able to find, that seems to be true.
And so let's talk about William before we get into the war. Let's talk about the slavery. The family owned only a handful of slaves. They were a small slave-owning family. Was were the James brothers raised to be like inveterate racists in the sense that they believed that all the black people should go back to Africa, or that they were right to be subservient, or was there any indication that their Christian upbringing made them actually feel a bit more tolerant towards at least their personal slaves?
Well, I think it's clear that they would have thought black people inferior, and they would have seen their roles as servants and as being owned as just the natural order of things. I didn't see anything that seemed to indicate that they were particularly malicious or mistreated the slaves that they had on their farm.
So, what did the war do to the family on a personal level? You hear, these sort of Scarlett O'Hara type stories of slave-owning families, even especially the smaller ones, basically being ruined, and that this sort of reinforced that. It seems that the James brothers took this sort of to heart, as you mentioned earlier, and they used this sort of as an excuse for their post-war outlawry.
Well, there was, there was a very traumatic incident in that, Union militiamen came looking to their farm to find out where Frank was. They were, of course, after the guerrilla leader that Frank was under Quantrill. And, they horsewhipped Jesse to get him to give up the location of his brother. They hung his stepfather multiple times. They would hang him and let him choke and then lower him down in an effort to get him to talk. And that had to be a very traumatic, difficult thing to live through. And it would have to change the way you think about the people that did that.
Well, were the brothers involved in any of the fighting pre-war in, like, say, Bleeding Kansas during those skirmishes?
I don't believe so. I don't think they had a connection until Frank actually joined the Confederacy.
So you mentioned William Quantrill. For those people who don't know, who was William Quantrill, and also his subordinate, Bloody Bill Anderson?
Well, they were guerrilla fighters. They were unofficial units that were put together. They tended to do hit and run raids. They couldn't very well do a stand up fight against regular infantry. And the the situation in Missouri is really sort of hard to wrap your head around. If you owned a farm, at any point a group of men might ride up, and they might be Union militia, they might be Confederate militia, they might be soldiers of either stripe. And if you had something they needed or wanted, they would probably take it, and they might kill you. There were cases where Confederate militia murdered Union sympathizers. There were cases where Union militia murdered secessionists. It was just a brutal, terrifying time.
So, were either of the brothers then officially enlisted with, say, the Missouri? I guess it would have been the Missouri militia, or reserves or whatever. Were they ever part of a regular army?
Frank was, and then from what I read, he caught the measles, was captured, and was given his parole. Basically, if you swear not to come back and fight, they would just let you go home. And apparently, Frank broke his parole to join the guerrillas.
Was Jesse too young to serve at that point?
Jesse was 16 when he joined the guerrillas, so yeah, he was still too young when he did join the war.
Uh, and there was a famous massacre called the Centralia Massacre. Um, can you explain a little bit about that and the James brothers' involvement in that?
Uh, Bloody Bill Anderson, with his with all the guerrillas he could gather up, rode into Centralia, and they shot any man or teenager that they saw that was male. They looted stores, they robbed banks, they burnt down buildings. They stacked cross ties and whatever they could find on the railroad. And when the train came through, they went through it and they found 24 Union soldiers that were basically on leave. They were headed back home after the Battle of Atlanta to see their families, and then they would, of course, return to the fight. And they took them off the train, and they stripped them to their underwear, and they shot and killed all but one of them that they kept as a hostage to exchange for one of their own who had recently been captured. It was one of the worst war crimes of the war.
Now, was this all? Because I know when was it either Quantrill or Anderson? One of them, I believe, were killed and then had their head put on a pike outside of the town they were killed. Is that so?
I don't think so. I know that Anderson was chased down and he was killed, and I found a couple of mentions of decapitation, but they didn't seem to be from credible sources.
So when the Civil War ended, I know you mentioned T.J. Stiles, who had written a book 20 years ago. I remember when I reviewed it, I was not too high on the book because I thought it was trying to exploit too much of the then current 9/11 mythos where everyone was a terrorist and whatnot. Are you more of the belief that the James brothers were sort of, I guess we'd put it like, they used the war and its aftermath as a reason to cover up their own crimes driven by avarice, or do you believe that they viewed themselves as terrorists in the lost cause?
Well, they definitely had a stake in the lost cause, but I really think that after going through the fighting, the killing, the atrocities of the war, that they just couldn't lead normal lives. I think they turned to crime, and I think that really the lost cause was more of an excuse than a reason, if you follow me.
Yeah, that's generally been my position because as I've read over the years a handful of books about Jesse James, as well as looking through online stuff and old what you would call criminal almanacs or encyclopedias. So the James gang was also involved with the starting up of their own criminal group with Cole Younger and the Younger brothers. So who were the Younger brothers, and what was their relation to the Jameses? Had they served with them in the military? Were they just people that they knew from around the town they grew up in? What was the dynamic between those two sets of brothers?
I believe the Youngers were also from Missouri, and I believe that the James boys knew Cole Younger from the war. But they had all been guerrilla fighters, so they had that in common, and that very intense experience. They knew that they could trust each other both in terms of loyalty and in terms of courage under fire, that they weren't going to flake out when things got hot.
So when was the first post-war crime that they committed? Was it just a random murder? Was it the robbing of a train, the robbing of a bank, the robbing of just people on the road?
Well, if you're talking about Frank and Jesse, the first real solid proof that we have is the Davies County Savings Bank in Gallatin, Missouri. But before that, there was There were robberies in Liberty, Alexander, Mitchell and Company, Savannah, Richmond, Russellville, Kentucky, and it looks like Archie Clement. So Bloody Bill Anderson was the guerrilla leader, but the brains behind Anderson's outfit was a guy named Archie Clement. I think he was. I think he just had a head for strategy, and he seems to have started the bank robbing, and at some point Frank and Jesse joined him, and the lineup of the gang kind of is pretty fluid throughout. I think at some point at that point it would have included the youngers, and that over time that they just again it just changed, and the James boys kind of rose to the top over time, or at least gained the most recognition.
So if you put aside something like the war crimes, like you mentioned, the Centralia massacre, is the first known murder committed by the James brothers? There was an innocent kid killed during the Liberty, Missouri robbery. A teenage boy was shot accidentally or not. Was that the first documented murder by the James boys?
Well, I'm not altogether sure that they were at that particular robbery. The belief seems to be that the cashier in the bank, as soon as the robbers got outside, started yelling that the bank had been robbed. The belief is that the young boy was also yelling that the bank had been robbed, and that one of the gang shot him because of that, or it could have just been accidental.
So one of the things that people have attributed to the fame or the rise of both Jesse and Frank, but Jesse especially, was the fact that the then governor of Missouri put out a bounty on their heads, and apparently it was more, or it was far greater than the previous record for a bounty, and this actually sort of backfired in terms of public sympathy for the James brothers. Who was the governor? What was the bounty? And how did that sort of help, in an odd way, the James brothers?
Well, I believe it's Governor McClure, and that I'm trying to think of which crime caused him to put out the bounty. I believe it is it's the Daviess County Saving Bank of Gallatin, Missouri. Jesse shot and killed the cashier, a gentleman named Captain John Sheets. He mistook Sheets for a gentleman named Samuel Cox, who killed Bloody Bill Anderson. So he shot him in the heart, and then he shot him in the head. He wounded a lawyer that happened to be in the bank at the time and was attempting to flee. And they only made out with like $700, and the governor put out a $3,000 reward on them because of the straight up executing the cashier. And in Stiles' book, he says that basically afterwards that Jesse James bragged about killing the man he thought was Samuel Cox. I mean, he'd bring it up in conversation.
Now, one of the odd things that happened in the James brothers' career is that one of the people who was at one of their bank robberies actually sued them in court, civil court, for having been, I guess, traumatized, and won a $200+ judgment that apparently was never collected. And some people suggest this gave rise to the idea that Jesse and Frank were gentlemen robbers.
No, I did come across that, and it is rather amusing. I hope he didn't have to spend a lot of money to get that judgment that was never paid. But that was the only real civil suit that I saw against them.
So there was, from the time of the end of the war, about a 10-year period where the brothers seemed to basically be uh, able to do almost what they wanted. Uh, uh, it was 1876 when they went into Northville, Minnesota, and that was considered the turning point in their career. The public, which not everyone, but a good portion of the American public, by this time knew the names Jesse and Frank James. Even the president of the United States knew the names and often would comment on it. This would have been Grant, I believe. Uh, so in that 10 years, what were they sort of like the equivalent of what gangsters were, like Goodfellas, mafiosi have been in, say, the last 40 or 50 years since The Godfather, uh, and what we mentioned, the dime novels that helped propagate their legend, because this was a time when a lot of these kinds of books came out. They so how was the Northfield robbery something other than being unsuccessful? How did that turn public sentiment against them? Because that seems to be a very key event.
Well, I'm not really sure how they kept public sentiment in their favor as long as they did. They robbed a train in Alder, Iowa, in which they came up with the clever idea of just basically uh, sabotaging the tracks and letting it crash. The engineer died, and the fireman later died. Several people were injured, and it just seems like the like taking a sledgehammer to hit a fly kind of overkill scenario. But to get back to Northfield, I think a big part of Northfield is that Joseph Lee Haywood, the cashier, he was so heroic and so he really improvised to avoid letting them get the cash. And there were two other bank employees there to see and report what he did. And I really think that is, and that, there was an innocent bystander who didn't even speak English, who was shot off his horse in the street a few minutes later. I really think that is what, you can't have a hero without villains. And the fact that the whole thing went so horribly wrong for them, it kind of diminished people's, belief in their invincibility.
And also, I would think too, by that time, with the Indian Wars, there did come along this slew of other outlaws. I mean, certainly the James brothers benefited by being the earliest, amongst the earliest famed outlaws. Some of these other people that we mentioned, the Sam Basses or Billy the Kid, came along 15, 20 years later to sort of fill the void for if nothing else, the dime novels to make money. But so what the downfall of the James gang from in the eyes of the public, this leads us to the famed death/murder of Jesse. If you could, for those who don't know, just give us sort of a recap about it and how that was then received in the media of the day.
Well, basically, Jesse ran out of Civil War guerrillas that he could recruit to be part of his gang. So he pretty much had to settle for common criminals, but people he felt like he could trust and had some degree of competency with a gun. But he recruited a guy named Charlie Ford, and his brother Robert came along for the ride. And what Jesse didn't know is they had talks with Governor Crittenden to bring in Jesse, and it's not entirely clear if the governor intended for them to bring in Jesse dead or alive. But I think the populace as a whole kind of settled on dead, and that's how it turned out. Basically, they just hung around with him, and then one day he took off his gun belt and got up on a chair to either dust or adjust a picture on the wall of the house that he was renting. And when he did, Robert Ford just pulled out his revolver and shot him in the back of the head. It was straight up murder.
The irony, though, you mentioned, and that the James brothers started out as bushwhackers, and one of the things that bushwhackers do is they don't fight you face up. They sort of they hide and they come in. So, in a sense, it's a poetic sense of justice, in that he got what he probably did to who knows how many people, but because the of the way it was, and I believe he was using the alias of Howard. You got the
He
coward
was.
who killed Mr. Howard, and it became I think, didn't it become a popular song in saloons?
Yes, that very same year, the Ballad of Jesse James came out, and uh, it, it became a very popular folk tune. And you know, the entry goes: Jesse James was a lad that killed many a man. He robbed the Glendale train. He stole from the rich and he gave to the poor. He had a hand, a heart, and a brain. Then the chorus goes: well, Jesse had a wife to mourn for his life. 3 children, they were brave. Well, that dirty little coward that shot Mr. Howard, he laid poor Jesse James in his grave. And that both perpetuated the myth of Jesse James as Robin Hood, and it forever branded Robert Ford a coward, which frankly seems appropriate.
So after the war, the brothers have, as we mentioned, sort of a decade of fame, and at least some public support. Then after Northfield, they sort of fall into the basement of public opinion, that they're just a bunch of criminals and cowards and bank robbers who shoot innocent people. And then the death seems to reverse that again and gives Jesse James, a so-called life after death. Go ahead.
Yeah, to come back to Major Lewis Redmond for a moment, what I finally decided was that, Jesse James, like Billy the Kid, he died, pretty much as an outlaw, where Redmond was in 1881. They finally chased him down, and he was shot like a dozen times, but miraculously he pulled through, went to prison, and was later pardoned, and actually worked at a legal distillery making liquor for a few years before he finally died. So it really, if you're going to be a legendary outlaw, you kind of have to die on the job.
So, before we talk about sort of the afterlife of Jesse James, let's deal with his brother Frank, because Frank, from what I've read, basically reformed. I mean, I guess you can't ever totally live down your past, but he lived for a few more decades, and he became a legend to a degree himself, but he sort of, in a sense, outlived his past, when he sort of died in anonymity, especially compared to the way Jesse died. Tell me a little bit about the afterlife of Jesse's older brother, his post-criminal life.
Well, in September of 1883, he actually, excuse me, in October of 1882, he surrendered to the governor. He basically turned himself in, and he was tried for 2 crimes: the Rock Island train robbery and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers payroll robbery in Alabama. And He was in jail for about a year while these trials took place. And he was acquitted, and he was never extradited to Minnesota for that disastrous robbery there. And so he spent a year in jail, never saw the inside of a penitentiary, and lived to be 72 years old.
Now, one of the more interesting things about Jesse James after his death was, other than the increasing fame with the dime novels and then eventually silent films and then the Hollywood treatment during countless westerns, is that there were a number of people over the decades from the late 1800s to maybe even midway through the 20th century that claimed to be Jesse James. This was sort of the original conspiracy kind of theory that Jesse hadn't died, even though he had been buried. What was Jesse James actually viewed in a casket, or was it a closed casket because of the shot?
No, back then, when the sheriff shot you down, they put you in a box in front of the undertakers, and they let people come by and have a look. And they definitely did that with Jesse.
So, how many people over the decades claim to be Jesse James? Because there's one or two that were really famous decades later.
Well, in 1995, the James family allowed Jesse to be exhumed and to have his DNA tested because they were just tired of all these stories of Jesse faking his own death and then, going to Texas or wherever and living out the rest of his life. And a forensic scientist named James Stars did 12 different tests, 13 of which were positive, and he also tested the mitochondrial DNA. Now, your mitochondrial DNA, unlike your nuclear DNA, comes from your mother. So, for example, Frank, Jesse, and his sister would all have the same mitochondrial DNA, but it's still a pretty powerful indicator. And then in 2000, they tried to exhume the body of a man named J. Frank Dalton in Texas. And he died in 1951 at the age of 104. And for the second half of his life, at least, he claimed to be Jesse James. Unfortunately, it was inconclusive in that when they exhumed his grave, the person in his grave had their right arm amputated. And since both Jesse and Mr. Dalton died with two arms, they obviously had the wrong grave, and they just put him back.
And the Frank Dalton that you mentioned, there was another outlaw named Frank Dalton too, and this Frank Dalton claimed to be Frank Dalton, the outlaw, before he claimed to be Jesse James.
I did not know that.
Oh, okay. So let's talk about some of the popular portrayals of Jesse James. Is there any movie or book that you think was particularly powerful in establishing the romantic version, if you will, capital R romantic version of the Jesse James saga?
Well, Jesse James throughout time has been played by an incredible array of actors. I'm told that the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, starring Brad Pitt, is pretty much the most accurate of the movies made about Jesse James. The early movies are just whatever script they had laying around. They just changed the lead's name to Jesse James, and they were off to the races. My favorite being the 1966 film Jesse James Meets Frankenstein's Daughter, which was apparently a double feature with a lot of theaters and drive-ins with Billy the Kid versus Dracula, made roughly at the same time and roughly the same place, as you might imagine.
So I talked earlier about how differently outlaws were viewed from, say, modern serial killers. But you also did say that you believed that Jesse James himself was a sociopath. Probably Frank James wouldn't fit into that template. But what? Well, let's talk about the two aspects of his crimes. Most notably, how much money did the James brothers get away with, and what is the estimated number of people that they maimed, injured, and or killed?
Well, I just really couldn't come up with anything like a hard number
Yeah.
on either the amount of money or the number of people killed. It's just too fluid. The gang's membership changes all the time. They're different. Even the same robbery reported over different times has different amounts. Paul Harvey did a rest of the story on Jesse James, where he estimated his take from the robberies at $32,336, and he did not share his methodology, and I really don't think he had one.
I remember as a boy, I was born in 1965, watching an episode as a kid of the Brady Bunch, of all things. And the youngest child there, Bobby, apparently in one episode started fancying himself as a Jesse James worshiper. And they did one of those kinds of special, very special kind of episodes where they had a supposed, uh, I think it was the son of a man Jesse James supposedly killed, an old man who set Bobby right as to Jesse James. And I remember it being one of the first times that I had either read or seen something where Jesse James wasn't portrayed in a heroic thing. Most of the books from the 40s, 50s, 60s that were still around did have this romantic view of Jesse James. Is there any similar book or movie or television show or whatever where you was say, oh, Jesse James, that's a famous name, but he wasn't a good guy, or did you initially, whenever you first saw or heard the name Jesse James, get that romantic view of Jesse the Robin Hood?
Well, if you look at the 50s, 60s, 70s, it really is a very positive view of Jesse James. And, again, it's just the myth just overtook reality there. And that's about that. That's how that worked out. But it's, not really historically accurate. One of the interesting things about Harvey's treatment of Jesse James is he claimed that Jesse would have been better off if he had just been a farmer and grew corn or wheat or maybe labradoodles. He estimated Jesse's hourly pay for his 15 years as an outlaw at $1.04 an hour. Um, uh, Harvey made a couple mistakes. He forgot about inflation. If he did indeed make 32,000 and change, in prior to 1882, that would have been well over $1 million today, which is like $32.50 an hour, or $67,000 a year. And also farmers don't really work a 40-hour week. They put in a lot more time for that than that, from what I've been able to discover.
So let's talk about how Jesse James is viewed now in the early 21st century. I know that there are a number of Jesse James museums. I lived in Minnesota for a dozen years, many years ago, and I know that they celebrated the defeat of the James Younger gang in Northfield, Minnesota, every year. They'd have like a county fair festival kind of thing. What is the modern take on James? Is there anyone that still views him in a positive light, other than say some unreconstructed Confederate?
Well, I really don't think the general public really has a great grasp of the facts of Jesse James. I would expect that, if I asked 100 people on the street who was the most famous outlaw of all time, I really expect, very high numbers would say Jesse James. But if you asked them if he was a good guy or a bad guy, I really think more than half would tell you that he was all right.
Uh, would that be across the USA? And is Jesse James? I don't know if you know. Is he known as a figure outside of the U.S. or is he just an American figure?
I think he's internationally famous. I
Yeah.
really do.
Who would you say through history, either in the Old West or post Old West, is the closest parallel to a Jesse James? Is it someone like Dillinger, John Dillinger?
Dillinger, maybe Machine Gun Kelly. You know, I think Capone is widely seen as being a horrible human being. I don't think anybody would, well, not anyone. I don't think most people would mistake him for a hero. But yeah, Dillinger's probably your guy.
So, in all this research, do you plan yourself on doing a book about Jesse James? And if so, what would be your take on him?
Well, I'm not currently planning a book. I might do some more articles on him, and what I would probably do is look at some of the crimes themselves.
Hmm.
I think I could do a pretty good write up on the train robberies. Or you could do the bank robberies, but for whatever reason, I'm more interested in the train robberies because they seem to have evolved in their methodology after that first robbery where they meddled with the tracks. They would just basically, at least I think in one instance, they just picked a really small town with a really small depot, and they just rounded everybody up and took them to the depot, and when the train stopped, they robbed it.
So talk about that. What was their methodology, just to get a view of their thinking, both Frank and Jesse and the youngers. When they robbed a bank, were these elaborately planned out, or were they just making things up as they went along, generally?
Well, they seem to have tried to have gathered intelligence. They did at least two train robberies where they strongly believed that there was going to be gold bullion on the train in the express car. And in both cases, their intelligence just failed them. Um, you know, as far as the Northfield robbery, there's two accounts of that. One account says that they thought there was $50,000 had recently been deposited there. I think one of the youngers, perhaps Cole, suggested that there was more of a political motive, that it was more about whose money was in that bank.
So, just a few more questions. Mentioned earlier how the James brothers were relatively amongst the first outlaws to get into the public imagination, long before the Butch Cassidys or the Billy the Kids. But a lot of people, if we think on a map, how big was the range of their criminality? You talked that I think you said Frank served time down, what was it, in Louisiana or Mississippi? Did they ever make it into Texas? We know they got as far as Minnesota northwise, but what was their range in terms of the four major directions?
Well, I know they robbed banks in Kentucky
Uh-huh.
and West Virginia, and we think that they robbed a stagecoach in Texas. I'm not 100% sure. I don't think we're 100% sure on that. They went as far north as Minnesota. They went as far south as Muscle Shoals, Alabama,
Hmm.
which is fairly south.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the reason I ask is because people have this idea of the mythic West, where it's like just all one place, where Billy the Kid and Jesse James knew each other, and they were but these people are separated sometimes by decades, 25, 30 years. Some of the most famous criminals, and they're also separated by geography. So yeah, it's just interesting to put that in brief. What is the one thing that you think that, about Jesse James' career, or any other part of his life that people don't know, that is a key element in understanding him and where he came from and what he did?
Well, I really think that, a lot of it just goes back to his childhood, the death of his father, his mother being such a staunch secessionist, his brother fighting the war. I think he probably idolized Frank, and he wanted, to join Frank in that unit, and that was just such brutal fighting. I mean, there were ambushes, there were dismemberments, there were robberies. It was just you can't really go through something that brutal and come out the other end, whole. It's just hard.
And when you used the term earlier, sociopath, there's a lot of people who try to make distinctions between that and a psychopath. Do you think that Jesse James was of a natural criminal bent, and that the circumstances of his life let him exploit that, or do you think that was he someone who was sadistic, that he enjoyed killing people? What is your own personal idea if you were to be able to sit him down and shrink his head?
Well, I'm gonna go with nurture and not nature on this one.
Uh-huh.
I really think that the Civil War and the early loss of the father, and being so his mother being so staunchly rigid in her beliefs, that yeah. And I may have gone a little bit overboard, but he was, he had a lot of hate that he had to process. I mean, uh, he really wanted to kill the man that killed Bloody Bill Anderson. He really wanted revenge and vengeance for some of the things that he'd seen, and he had to be, haunted by some of the things he did, because that guerrilla war in Missouri was just horrific. I mean, it was just so brutal and so up close, and the hatred on both sides was so deep that you just can't go through something like that and come back whole. That's how it works.
So, finally, let me ask you: what is the next book, and on what crime or what criminal are you focusing on, and what is it that interests you about certain criminals versus other criminals that don't interest you, or certain crimes?
Well, my current work in progress is a book called Carolina Moonshine Kings, where I'm going to write about some legendary moonshiners and bootleggers, and just the whole process and history of moonshining in North and South Carolina. And, I specialize in Appalachian crime stories, and the way my explanation for that is that my grandfather, Alfred Barry Dockery, was a graduate of Central Prison.
Mm-hmm.
My father, Elmer Dockery, was a graduate of Parris Island, and I'm a graduate of North Carolina State University. So I have a great interest in both Appalachian crime and moonshining, but I also write about other crimes as well. And I have a back burner project that's going to be quite a bit broader, but I'm going to keep that under my hat for now until I get it a good bit further towards completion.
Well, I want to thank you for spending about an hour speaking about the myth and the man, Jesse James, Alfred Dockery. Thank you again.
You're welcome, Dan. I enjoyed it.